2, 3, 4. Let me tell you about PuckPedia, stats, contracts, and caps. It's all there for you. One-stop shop for your hockey information. It's a hockey sensation. So log on, log on, log on. If you give a puck, go to PuckPedia.com.
Welcome to episode 9 of the PuckPedia Hockey Show. We welcome back the founder of PuckPedia, Hart Levine. Hart goes into the summer and some of the moves that happened in the offseason that it really excited him. And then we dive into some of the nitty gritty of the salary cap with the upcoming CBA changes this year. We talk about the playoff salary cap, really understanding, how it's calculated, how it's going to impact some of these teams this offseason. Would teams like Florida and Edmonton have been playoff salary cap compliant last year in the Stanley Cup playoffs? We get into all that good information. And then we talk about the LTIR, right? How is that going to be set for this upcoming season? There's 4 teams currently that are going to be leveraging LTIR most likely. And so Hart dives into how teams are going to optimize that to really maximize every single dollar and cent they're able to go over the salary cap. We dive into some of the capologist questions as well towards the end of the episode. And it's really just a great episode and get a lot of good information out. And don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube page. This podcast is also available on all of your podcast apps, whether you want to watch it on YouTube or listen on Apple or Spotify. That's how you get this PuckPedia Hockey Show podcast. So without further ado, let's drop the puck. We now welcome on a very special guest, the founder of PuckPedia, the guy who makes all of this possible. It's Hart Levine. Hart, how you doing?
Doing great. How you doing?
I'm good. Summer's been great. We're about a week and a half away from the NHL season starting back up. Tuesday, October 8th. We've had a lot of interesting things happen over the summer. First off, how was your summer, and what are some of the things that kind of caught your eye this summer in terms of the hockey transactions?
Had a great summer, I think in part because August was pretty slow. So had a little bit of downtime. In past years, there's a little more action in August. Last year, we had the offer sheet activity. So this year was a little slower. I think to me, one of the key takeaways is it's really musical chairs for free agents. And if they don't sign July 1st, maybe like by July 3rd, they're looking at not a great deal, or in some cases not even having a deal. We look at a guy like Jack Roslovic, who's still out there as we were recording this. I do know he had some offers on July 1st and then some not as good offers by mid-August. But yeah, if you don't jump on them, those offers evaporate. And so now he's a guy that is clearly, an NHL player, probably even a top 6 NHL player, or at least top 9, sitting there without a deal. We have a 40-point defenseman, Matt Grzelcyk, on a PTO. Again, wonder what kind of offer was there for him on July 1st that he didn't take. So yeah, it shows that hockey, unlike the other sports, the free agency is really a game of grab a chair or you might be left standing, missing the next song.
Yeah, timing is kind of everything in those situations. We also have a big RFA still unsigned with Luke Hughes in New Jersey. I know talks seem to be going back and forth between the Devils camp as well as his camp at CAA and Pat Brisson. Luke Evangelista is also an unsigned RFA. One RFA that did sign over the weekend was Mason McTavish, signing for a 6-year, $7 million AAV deal. We also had Anthony Stolarz sign over last week for the Toronto Maple Leafs, with Joseph Wall kind of being MIA for them right now. That was a big deal to get done. The extension kicks in next season. And then we also have Aleksander Barkov, some news, not on the contract front, but got hurt for Florida. So things are happening. Even today at practice, JT Miller for the New York Rangers also got injured. We'll see what the extent of that injury would be for the New York Rangers. But a lot going on right now just in the last few days leading up to the season.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot to touch on there, but like Luke Hughes, I think, that's going to be a long-term deal and they're just trying to work out the key terms. Whereas Luke Evangelista, that's a short-term deal, a bridge deal, but I think those sides are kind of more entrenched in their position. So, even though we're talking more money, for Luke Hughes and probably even in total dollars, the gap is probably bigger. I would still guess that deal gets done sooner than Evangelista. And the other one that's still out there is Alexander Holtz with Vegas. We'll talk about him, I'm sure, a bit later. But yeah, I mean, we've seen in the past, if you miss a couple days of training camp, it's not a big deal. You miss all of training camp or even the first part of the season, it's really hard to catch up because, it's not about being in shape, but it's about like that game action and the timing. And so it can really have an impact. And so, Mason McTavish, I think, it's interesting that they did work out a long-term deal because we've seen in the past, Anaheim is notorious with both their GM and the AGM of being really tough negotiators. We've seen in the past it gets resolved on a short-term deal, and then within a year or so the guys are gone. With McTavish, so they did get to a long-term deal. So I guess hopefully for Ducks fans, that is going to be a long-term relationship, and the negotiating did not fray it to the point where he's going to get moved soon.
Yeah, McTavish was the third overall pick in the 2021 NHL draft, but this deal also buys 2 years of UFA for McTavish. So a very good deal for both sides here. And I think we'll just kind of have to see how it plays out. We also have the next summer kind of being something that could be really, really big in terms of none of those big UFAs signed extensions, which they could have started on July 1st. We have Kirill Kaprizov turning down the largest NHL contract in history, reportedly, an 8-year, $16 million per year a deal. Connor McDavid still unsigned. We have Jack Eichel still unsigned. Kyle Connor still unsigned. Artemi Panarin as well. So things could be shaping up for a big summer in 2026.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing too is we're seeing less, 7, 8 year deals, right? We're seeing shorter either bridges or, a McTavish at 6 years, which before that would have just seemed like an automatic 8 year deal. Luke Hughes, we'll see. Like you'd think if it was an 8 year deal, they probably would have been there, and so I wouldn't be surprised if that's a couple of years shorter. I think that's with the rising cap and teams having cap space. There's a lot of teams with cap space for next summer, especially you mentioned some of those key free agents. That's money that's not then yet spent. I think we're seeing more and more players take shorter deals. The exception being players that are like they really haven't proven as much in the NHL. We got like a Frank Nazar was one example. Jackson Blake. Those are the kind of deals where you could see the player, hey, I haven't even played a full season or just over a season. This is a lot of guaranteed money. I'll take it. And the team thinking, hey, if we wait another season or let them finish, get to be an RFA, it's going to cost us a lot more. So those seem to be the kind of players that you can now get on like a 7, 8 year deal. It's those younger guys that don't have that big track record. But everyone else, it seems that those deals are getting shorter. And even though you can still sign an 8 year deal now, and even next summer you can sign a 7 or 8 year deal. The new limits don't go effect till next September. It looks like all the deals are kind of moving a little shorter.
Yeah, it's more of like an NBA style kind of contract, right? Where the kind of superstars are signing those 4-year, 5-year max deals, as opposed to really going for the actual NHL max term of 7, 8 years. Also, with the rising cap, right, in the next 2 years, it's projected to be up to about $113.5 million, possibly even more. I mean, in 4 years, we could see that salary cap being close to $125 million. So I think a lot of uncertainty there and players really wanting to capitalize on maximizing every dollar they could have. So I think a lot of the changes in the salary cap and some of those CBA changes that you mentioned that we'll dive into in a second here are really kind of impacting what we see in free agency, and all these teams now being armed with cap space. Cap space isn't necessarily as valuable or crucial as it was, let's call it 2, 3, 4 summers ago.
Yeah, and I think part of why some of these negotiations are tough is, we know the cap's going up. The agents and the players are saying that the comparables we're all using from last year or the year before, we need to adjust for what that represents in a higher cap. We're basically using the percentage of the cap, and teams just like aren't necessarily fully there yet. They're still used to players, what a $5 million player was a year or two ago, and it's hard to realize that with the cap going up, that's worth a lot more now, and they're trying to like push or at least get a little bit of a discount off that same percentage of the cap. And so I think as we get a little bit more experience where the cap is rising so much each year, maybe some of these deals become a little easier because it's sort of obvious that you have to pay for that cap adjusted number. But for now, I think we're seeing that it's that transition time that's causing a little bit of friction in the negotiations.
Definitely. And you have the agents doing their job on the one side of things. They're trying to get as much value for their clients as possible. You have the teams on the other side of things fighting to protect every single dollar available to them and their cap so that they can maximize their own teams. So it just really feels like a tug and pull here in this current situation.
Yeah. And then you have Puckpedia trying to account for it all and add it all up, right?
And that's why the fans love PuckPedia, the top transaction salary cap website on the market right now, puckpedia.com. Hart, do we have any kind of new features coming up for PuckPedia this upcoming season?
Yeah, I think the big one that we just released now this week is we're now showing a projected playoff cap number and cap space. This is, since the transition rules came out, and with the big surprise that those were going to affect this year, the playoff cap, we had a lot of requests to get that added. So that's now on the site. If you're on a team page, you can see their projected playoff cap hit and cap space. On our teams page, where you see all the teams combined, you can see it. And when you use our PuckGM interactive roster tool, you can see what the projected playoff cap hit would be for that roster. And as you make roster moves, you can see it change. So, we're using what the projected lineup is for the next upcoming game and showing what that cap space would be. And as we've talked about, the playoff cap is based on the 20 dressed players. So certainly it makes a big difference, if a player's injured, when they're going to come back. We're projecting, for this next game, what that playoff cap it would be. So definitely should go in there and use PuckGM and see what it looks like when a Matthew Tkachuk or someone is healthy and gets added to the lineup. But yeah, now all the rules are programmed in there and you can see what that looks like. And I think, right now, obviously all the teams would be under the playoff cap because it's just the 20 healthy guys. But as we get during the season, teams make accrue space and then make trades and use that space, and some of the nuances about how the playoff cap differs from the regular season cap. I think we'll start to see later in the year some teams like lineups that they're dressing for a regular season game wouldn't actually be compliant in the playoff cap, and we'll start to see some of those differences between the regular season cap and the playoff cap. So I think that's a interesting thing to check out and to kind of follow it as we go along the season.
Hart, do you maybe want to take a step back here and kind of explain to the fans who are maybe unaware, like what exactly this playoff cap is? Like, from my understanding, it's basically that they're going to have the dressed roster in the playoffs is what counts for the salary cap. It's irregardless of the accrued salary cap space in the regular season. It includes all of the cap overages and the buyouts as well. It comes into that picture. So do you want to give the fans a little better understanding of what this playoff cap is and how it might impact some of these teams moving forward?
Yeah, you nailed it. So it's the 20 players that are dressed. So anyone that's injured or scratched does not count towards the playoff cap. And the playoff cap is the same as the regular season cap. So this year it's 95.5 million. So it's those 20 dressed players. That's kind of the easy part to understand. The nuances to it is, so during the season, a player is only charged to the team based on the number of days they're on the NHL roster for that team. So if a player gets traded partway through the season, they're only on that new player's cap for that portion of the season or that percentage of the season. But once you get to the playoffs, it's their full annual cap. So, a $10 million player that gets traded with a quarter of the season remaining, he's only charged on the regular season cap for $2.5 million. But if he's dressed in the playoffs, that's his full $10 million cap hit. Then we get into retention. So if a team receives a player that's been retained, they do get the benefit of that. So that $10 million player, let's say a team retains half. So he's a $5 million player. That he's only charged $5 million to the playoff cap, but again, it's for as if he was with on the roster for the full season. So there's no accrual or proration for when he was acquired. One of the intricacies of it, which is kind of funny or is getting some chatter amongst teams, is one of the charges to the team's cap, in addition to all the ones you mentioned. So all the annual charges that a team can avoid, like buyouts and previous retentions and overages from the previous year, those all get charged to the playoff cap as well. But one of the other ones is any buried cap charges are added. So if a team has a player that makes over the bearing threshold, which this season is 1.15 million, when they're in the minors, for every day that they're under, that the amount that's over 1.15 million is charged to the cap. So for example, last year, Spencer Knight spent the first day actually in the minors. And so Florida on their playoff cap would have had sort of 1 day of the amount of his cap at over the 1.15 million threshold. We could look at this season. Connor Ingram with Utah was waived and sent down. He carries an $800,000 buried cap charge. So if he was in the minors all season, in the playoffs, Utah would have that $800,000 charge for him. If he's only in the minors for half of the season, it would only be $400,000. So one thing that's really interesting and kind of weird about it, though, is so they're going to get charged in the playoffs for the buried cap hit charge that they had all season. But then if that player is actually dressed for them in the playoffs, they get charged with his full cap hit. So take Connor Ingram. He's a $1.95 million cap hit. If he's buried in the minors, he carries an $800,000 charge. Let's say he's buried all season. So there's an $800,000 charge then is charged to Utah for every game in the playoffs. However, if they have some injuries or he's done great and they want to dress him, now in the playoffs, they also have to account for his $1.95 million full cap charge. So the team would actually be paying like extra to have him in the lineup, what was buried for him during the season, and then his full cap charge. So that's an area where capologists around the league think, that doesn't seem quite right. Maybe this was a mistake or just something that was, a bit of an oversight. So maybe there's something that gets changed. I don't know if it would be changed for this year, but maybe in future years, because they did leave it open that they could fix some elements. But that's a weird one where a player could be in the minors for a team for part of the year, and then if he plays for them in the playoffs, they're going to be charged for his full annual cap it plus the amount that was when he was buried during the season.
Yes, using that example, Connor Ingram would basically be charged almost $3 million on the playoff cap if he was buried through the entire year and then played, even though he's only
He's a
on the salary cap up
1.95.
for
Yeah.
1.95 million.
That
So
that seems silly, right?
that is pretty silly, and I know. What do you think the general consensus around the league is on this playoff cap? I mean, I know some teams, obviously, and we'll get into LTIR in a second. Teams were really upset that you can just kind of have any guys show up in the playoffs if they were on LTIR during the season. So do you think that teams are in favor of this new playoff cap, or do you think that they're in favor of the concept, but maybe not exactly how it played out?
You nailed it. I think that they're in favor of some sort of playoff cap, but I getting a lot of dissatisfaction with the actual rules and the mechanism. It just seems like maybe it wasn't all modeled out, or enough feedback wasn't solicited from the people that actually have to make the numbers work. Yeah, a couple of things that just are. I mentioned the buried cap charge issue. Another one is the no proration, right? So a team has space, accrues space during the season, adds a player at the deadline, and then it's not that that doesn't have any value come the playoff because you're only dressing 20 players in the playoffs. So you do get some benefit of not having to have your full 23-man roster or 23 plus injured guys, but you've definitely lessened the impact of accruing space because you on a $10 million, like we talked about, if you accrue so you can add a $10 million player at the deadline, he's only charged just over 2 million to your regular season cap. You still have to have room for him for 10 million to dress him in the playoffs. And even, not counting the 3 or 5 injured guys, that's not going to make up that gap of like 8 million. So it certainly leads to less, I would think it would lead to less trade action because there's just some teams that sure they can afford a player in the regular season, but they would look at their playoff potential roster and see that that's not going to work. I think there's also going to be like some games played. Like it's only the 2 goalies that are dressed, so a team might have 2 expensive goalies. Well, then in the playoffs, just dress your third string guy at the league minimum and have your expensive backup sit in the press box unless someone gets hurt. And in the playoffs, you could, if a guy gets hurt, your third goalie can get dressed and go and go sit on the bench, right? So you'd have to have 2 injuries, but still, like it's not like that expensive backup wouldn't be available. So I'm sure that's not really what was intended as well. And the other one that's a little interesting is so the team that obtains a player that was retained, they're getting it after retention, but with no proration for the season. But the team that is doing the retaining, that retention is actually prorated. So if a team retains on a $10 million player 50% halfway through the season, they retain 5 million, but because it was only at halfway of the season, they're only going to be charged 2.5 million to their regular season cap hit, and it's still 2.5 million to their playoff cap hit, which conceptually that makes sense. But the fact that the other side of it, the team receiving the player doesn't get the benefit of the proration, that it seems a little incongruous as well. So yeah, there's a few elements there where it's like, okay, we agree that there should be a playoff cap, but some of these rules probably need some tweaking. And I would be very surprised if by the end of the CBA, which let's say 4 or 5 years from now, there haven't been some tweaks or changes to it. I'm sure that they'll get some feedback when it's actually being used, and it's like a beta test, right? But it's actually out to the public, and so there'll be some feedback and probably some tweaks to it.
Yeah, I saw some agents too make some comments where basically there can be a scenario in the playoffs where you have your fourth, fifth, sixth best defender getting scratched because the team simply can't afford them, and you're having to play like not your strongest lineup strictly due to this cap. Where previous years that was never even a thing. You're gonna dress your strongest lineup in the playoffs and potentially winner take all game, and now you can't actually afford to field your best lineup.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing potentially is actually teams adding a whole bunch of depth because let's say your end of roster guys are whether it's league minimum or $2 million, you might as well have a whole bunch of extra guys making that same kind of money, as scratches. And then if someone gets hurt, you just plug them in. So, let's say your sixth defenseman makes 2 million. Well, you might as well trade for a $6 million or a $2 million defenseman at the deadline. And even if he's scratched and doesn't play any playoff games, we can plug him in if our guy gets hurt. Or you might as well have a whole bunch of like 775 guys or close to it. Again, like, who cares if they play, but if someone gets hurt, then you can plug them in. So yeah, there's a lot of strategy that will need to go into it, and some thinking of the real world impact of having a playoff cap.
Yeah, and I think this is a perfect transition into LTIR because a lot of this, the reason that the playoff cap was implemented was due to the long-term injured reserve, and some teams like Tampa Bay or Vegas placing a Mark Stone or Nikita Kucherov on LTIR, and then game one of the playoffs, those guys were playing because the salary cap did not matter in the playoffs. So let's start with the defending reigning Stanley Cup champions. We want to see a few different teams how they're going to use LTIR this season. So the Florida Panthers, right now, if you go to PuckPedia, they have minus $4.5 million in current cap space. They just had a brutal injury the other day with Aleksander Barkov, captain of the Florida Panthers, tore, I think, his ACL. So he's going to be out for possibly the whole regular season. They haven't announced yet if it's going to be a full season ending injury or if he's going to be able to return for the playoffs. He'll at least be out for the Olympics, which is just devastating for Finland and super unfortunate for the Panthers. But you also have Matthew Tkachuk and Thomas Nosek that are going to be injured for the first few months of the season. So can you explain maybe how the new LTIR is going to work? There's LTIR and then there's season ending LTIR now, and how you think Florida is going to leverage these new cap to optimize their salary cap.
Yeah, so Florida's a great example of the new change in LTIR. And we've actually now gone from having just LTIR and creating a separate sort of category of LTIR, which at Puckpedia, I think we've coined the term season ending LTIR. So Seth, our producer, when you put that on the screen, make sure you put a little copyright logo beside that new term SELTIR. So the basically for regular LTIR now, the maximum benefit a team can get is the league average salary from the year before, which this year is just over 3.8 million. It's 3.817 million. So if a player is injured and on LTIR, but will come back at some point in the regular season or playoffs, the maximum benefit or ability to exceed the cap would be that 3.8 million. So if a player's cap hit is less than that, it's their cap hit. But if a player's cap hit is over, like Matthew Tkachuk, the benefit is limited to that 3.8. But players that are going to be out for the regular season and the playoffs can be designated season-ending LTIR, and that would allow a team to utilize their full cap hit to exceed the cap. The really important thing with that, though, is once a player, and the player has to sign off on it as well. Once they're placed on that season-ending LTIR, they cannot play in the regular season or the playoffs. And so that's that rule change is really trying to get at what Tampa did with Kucherov, and what we've seen with teams where the injured player comes back for game one of the playoffs. If a team wants to use their full cap hit instead of the 3.8 million, he's gone for the regular season and the playoffs. And so that's when we get into Florida and we talk about like how they might submit their opening roster. That really has a big impact. So Florida, like you mentioned, we're projecting them 4.5 million over the cap. So we know Matthew Tkachuk will start on LTIR, and that's like 3.8 million. We know Nosek is out for several months, it sounds like, and he's at 775. So the most obvious way for them to set their LTIR pool is to submit a roster that is 4.5 million over the cap. With Matthew Tkachuk and Nosek on LTIR, they would be able to be just slightly more than that, but a little bit more than 4.5. But when you set an LTIR pool by being over the cap, the amount you're over, that's your LTIR pool. So for those two guys, the LTIR pool will be 4.5, meaning they can exceed the cap by 4.5 million while those guys are injured. What that does is it gives them a lot of time with Barkov. What they can do is the next day after they submit the opening roster, they could have Barkov to just regular LTIR. They could exceed the cap by another 3.8 and use that for call-ups or maybe even some in-season trades. And that will give them time to decide if he's going to come back at some point in the playoffs. And at some point, if they decide he's out and he's not going to be back for the playoffs, they can flip him to that season-ending LTIR. And now they can go from having 3.8 million that they can exceed the cap to his full 10 million that they can exceed the cap. But I think the real key is they don't have to make that decision right now, because between Tkachuk and Nosek and what their roster looks like right now, they can submit a cap compliant roster without having to make that decision on Barkov.
Yeah, and I think that's super interesting, and just a lot of these nuances now with the salary cap, and like how a lot of these team capologists have to reframe kind of what they've known to do the last few years. I think is pretty interesting, and we'll see how the defending Stanley Cup champs line up on night one. I think they open up the season on Tuesday, October 8th, against the Chicago Blackhawks. So it'll be interesting to see how Florida weathers that storm without Tkachuk and Barkov to start the season. Sam Bennett will probably slide into their first center role there, so give him an extended run with that new contract that he just signed this offseason. Another team we wanted to talk about are the Vegas Golden Knights. So they are now projected, according to PuckPedia, at minus $7.64 million against the cap, or over the cap rather. The big decision for them is Alex Pietrangelo. He has an $8.8 million cap hit. It seems that he's going to probably miss the entire season here. That was kind of the news that came out a few months ago. However, in like the last month or so, it seems like maybe there's a slight chance that he ends up playing. Like you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, they have restricted free agent Alexander Holtz. He's actually working through training camp with the team, but he currently remains unsigned because, like you said, they're kind of waiting to see what is going to play out with this Pietrangelo situation and how they're going to optimize that. So dive into a little bit of how you think Vegas is going to kind of set their LTIR to start the season, and what you're hearing on the Pietrangelo front, if you think there's a chance he actually ends up playing this season.
Vegas is the classic way of submitting an LTIR to start the season being over the cap. So again, when you start with the player on LTIR in the opening submission, that however much you're over the cap on that day, that's how much you can exceed the cap the rest of the season with just that player on LTIR. And so it seemed pretty obvious. Pietrangelo has an $8.8 million cap. We have them at 7.64 over the cap right now. It seemed obvious they were going to put him on that season-ending LTIR and be able to exceed the cap by that 8.8. But then he did some interviews and it sounded like maybe the door was open just a crack for him to come back. I'm sure the Vegas capologists, flipped their chair at that moment, because that would definitely change things. If he is not going to sign off that he is out all through the season and playoffs, they can only exceed the cap by 3.8 million. And that means that they're going to have to shed, about $4 million before the opening roster submission, which would be pretty hard. Obviously, that would mean some trades. You couldn't send enough players down to make that work. So I suspect that he was being optimistic and that he will sign off that he is out for the regular season and playoffs. But we'll have to see. But that's what it would look like. And in that case, so like I mentioned, they can exceed the cap by up to 8.8, but however much they're over the cap on their opening roster submission, that is the limit. So that's why I think, when I see Holtz is in camp on a PTO, even though he's an unsigned RFA, my capology spider senses are tingling. And I think this is going to be one which we've seen in the past where he's going to sign a contract shortly before opening rosters that is very close to the optimal amount to kind of maximize every dollar that they can spend. So that would mean for him that I would think his contract's going to be about 1.15 million or so. If they do that, that would get them to just about that 8.8 million over the cap. And, they've kind of then utilized every dollar available. But, let's say they gave him a little less. It doesn't help them because they wouldn't be able to spend it. That's kind of gone as they set their LTIR number. So I think they're probably waiting to see if they have any other injuries or maybe lose someone on waivers or want to claim someone on waivers. But I would think somewhere before that opening roster, we would see Holtz sign for a contract around that amount.
Can I ask a quick question too? So I just want to bring up something you just brought up. So with Alex Pietrangelo, before the season starts, they either have to designate him to be on LTIR or season-ending LTIR. And if he's not designated on the season-ending LTIR, but just the normal LTIR, then Vegas is only really allowed to be $3.8 million, give or take, over the cap. And right now, because they're currently about $7.6 million over the cap, they'd actually have to shed about $3.8 million or whatever that math is before the season starts in order to be cap compliant.
That's right. And that's why I think they probably said to Pietrangelo, I'm glad you want to try to come back, but it ain't happening. And we need you to sign here that you are out for the regular season and playoffs. So yeah, I mean, that would be a huge turn if he does not kind of agree that he's out for the playoffs as well. And they would have to make some serious roster moves.
And with this CBA, you said it has to be an agreement from both sides, right? The player and the
For
team both have
season-ending
to agree.
LTIR, it requires sign-off from the player and the PA, as well as the team and all the doctors. Yeah, the player has to consent that he is out. So, Carey Price got traded and San Jose, it doesn't matter. They're not going to be over the cap, but he'd be a guy, it seems like, obvious. He would sign and say, I'm out for the regular season and playoffs. But Pietrangelo, I thought, was in that camp, and then he gave some interesting interview comments. So we'll see. But again, I would think the very most likely outcome is he's on season-ending LTIR, and they make some roster moves, probably including signing a Holtz to get just under 8.8 over the cap to submit the roster.
Yeah, well, we'll see what Vegas decides to do on opening night. If Pietrangelo doesn't go on the season-ending LTIR, then Vegas will be open for business. And teams, I think the saying is, teams don't usually throw you a rope when you're drowning; they throw you an anvil. So I don't imagine teams will be willing to help Vegas out too much unless they're willing to add some sweeteners on those deals. Two more teams you wanted to touch on pretty quickly. Let's start with the Edmonton Oilers, back-to-back Western Conference champions. Their situation's a little bit interesting. So right now it says they have about $226,000 in cap space, right below that $95.5 million. In order for them to kind of look at their LTIR situation, I know you said Max Jones. He's a guy you look at. You weren't sure if he was going to be healthy or not to get waived. They also have the opportunity to put Zach Hyman on LTIR. It looks like he's going to be out for the first couple months of the season. What do you kind of expect Edmonton to do with their LTIR situation?
Yeah, so we've touched on with the previous teams we talked about, one method of setting an opening roster is to be over the cap with a player on LTIR. And therefore, when you do that, the amount you're over the cap becomes your LTIR pool and how much you can exceed the cap. The other method is you submit a roster that's under the cap without a player on LTIR. And then shortly after you submit that, then you add the player to LTIR. And in that case, your LTIR pool, or how much you can exceed the cap, is the injured players cap it now to this max of 3.8, less how much cap space you had on that submission. So that's where in past years, we've seen a lot of teams do a lot of roster moves and try to get, within like a dollar or two of the cap, or really close to it. It's kind of an informal thing amongst capologists. They check with me to kind of give the standings of who got the closest to optimizing LTIR. And some teams, they get to within zero or a dollar or $3, and it's like a friendly competition there. So the Oilers, again, unless they have some other injuries, and it sounds now like Max Jones is going to be healthy enough to potentially be waived and sent down, they're going to be an under the cap team to start the season. And in that case, it sounds like Hyman's out for just 1 month. So that would qualify for LTIR, but it's not. When you're using LTIR and over the cap, you lose out on accruing space. But whether they're a couple 100,000 under the cap or over or not accruing for just 30 days, that wouldn't have a huge impact on what they could do later in the season. So being under the cap by a couple 100,000 for 30 days, that adds up to maybe at the deadline, we're talking like 100 or 150,000 of annual cap that you could add. So a team where every dollar counts, sure, it matters, but it wouldn't be like catastrophic to their later season plans, assuming everyone else was healthy. So they might look at potentially submitting under the cap and then adding Hyman to LTIR, whether right away or maybe if they get some other injuries and they need to use that LTIR. So with them, if they, our projected roster has Stetcher on the NHL roster, and either Philp or Lazar, both are at 775. That would give them the 225. Potentially they could send down a guy like Ike Howard and have both Lazar and Philp, or potentially it's the Regula, maybe instead of a Stetcher, but you're somewhere in that, 225 to $400,000 range. So if that's how much space they had when then they subsequently put Hyman on LTIR, they could exceed the cap by that $3.8 million limit, less how much space they had. So, between 3.4 and 3.6 million, they could exceed the cap while Hyman's on LTIR if they go that route.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how the Oilers play out. Like you mentioned, I'm hoping to see the Iceman, Isaac Howard, on the opening roster. He's a player who brings a little bit of swagger to the team, and we'll see how that all plays out. Like you mentioned, they have a couple other smaller moves that they can make, but it sounds like maybe not using LTIR might be in their best interest so that they're able to accrue that little bit of cap space. Because like you mentioned, if you go on LTIR, then you kind of lose the ability to accrue cap space. The last team we're going to talk about really quick is the St. Louis Blues. So right now, they're currently $625,000 $65,000 under the cap. They have Torrey Krug on their roster right now, who's pretty much, I think he's already called it a career. So one way that they could do it, like you said, is they could submit the roster and then add Krug to that season-ending LTIR and exceed it by his $5.85 million. Or they can move some pieces around to kind of get closer to 6.5, which I think is like the optimal amount. So what do you kind of expect St. Louis to do here in this situation?
Yeah, you nailed it. So they're a team, under the cap, but they have a player that's out for the whole season, would be a candidate for season-ending LTIR, and potentially allow them to exceed the cap by his 6.5 million. So if we look right now, they look to be about 625 under the cap. So if they didn't do anything other than submit that roster, then put Krug on season-ending LTIR to start the year, they could exceed the cap by 5.85, which is his $6.5 million cap hit, less that 625 of space. Or to your point, they could make a few roster moves and try to get closer to like zero cap space, and they would be able to exceed the cap by closer to that 6.5 million versus the 5.85. But that's a team, potentially could do something like that. I think last year they were sort of in a similar situation and they waited a little bit, tried to see, are we going to be healthy and maybe we can accrue some space. But ultimately they ended up putting Krug on LTR and exceeding the cap. And I think like it would be hard for them to accrue enough space to kind of make up for the close to 6 million they could get with Krug on LTIR. So I think whether they do it on the first day or sometime in the season, I would think the most likely outcome is they do that move and put Krug on season-ending LTIR and exceed the cap by 6.5 minus however much cap space they have at that point.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see just how all these teams kind of facilitate these moves, and if there are injuries during the season, how teams, focus on putting guys on LTIR versus the season ending right away, like how all that's going to play out, and then that leads into the playoff cap. So there's going to be injuries that come along the way. There's going to be other teams that are going to need to use this LTIR. So we're going to see how all of it plays out. It's going to be kind of fun, especially for you on the Puckpedia side. Just the salary cap nerd in you is probably getting pretty excited and juiced up about how these capologists are really going to make all this stuff work this season.
I do like that, but typically, we put out an article before the season where I predict how teams will optimize LTIR. And typically I'm covering, 7, 10, 12 teams that might be doing it. So, it's fun for the first few, then it gets to be a bit of a slog. This year I'm happy there's, we're looking at maybe 4 teams, maybe another injury pops up, but it'll be a more manageable number of teams to sort of really dig into and analyze the optimal way to set the LTIR. So I love that part of it. And especially this season with having less teams to worry about.
Yeah, hopefully that JT Miller injury from practice today wasn't too serious because the Rangers right now have $685,000 in cap space. So they would definitely be another candidate that we might have to talk about on a future episode if that injury ends up being pretty serious. Let's wrap up our episode here, Hart, with our Ask the Capologist questions. So if you go on Puckpedia's website, you're able to submit questions that we receive directly, and then Hart goes through them and he wants to answer some. He basically picks a couple questions that are asked a few different times just to get a good answer for the fans and also give you guys a good understanding of what kind of goes into some of these salary cap nuances that someone like myself or the casual fan just doesn't really understand all that well. So this segment is presented by CoolBet. If you go to puckpedia.com/coolbet, you can get in on the action today. Stay cool, bet responsibly. CoolBet has some of the best lines in the game. Great markets for NHL futures. You can bet Stanley Cup odds. You have Calder Trophy odds like we talked about last episode. A lot of the other awards. And just as the games start coming into play, you can bet on the individual games themselves. So the segment is presented by CoolBet. Get in on the action. And like we said, you see on the banner on the bottom of the screen, if you go to puckpedia.com/coolbet, you can get in on the action today. So our first question, Hart, here comes from Derek L. He says, I see deadline cap space is higher than projected cap space. How does that work? And doesn't the new playoff cap change how space accrues?
Yeah, so that's a question we've received a lot of versions of it. So we have a few different cap space or cap hit numbers displayed on the site. I'll just quickly walk through them. So projected cap space, that is the roster that is with the team right now. So that's all the healthy players, all the injured players, all the scratch players, but everyone that's on the NHL roster. Projected cap hit and then the resulting projected cap space, that assumes that roster is that's the roster for the rest of the season. And that's how the NHL looks at transactions to decide if they're going to approve a call up or a trade or a signing. They look at that projected cap space number and they look to see if that fits. So that number, if a team doesn't make any roster moves, that would stay the same the whole season. Current cap space, which we show on the site, that is the annual cap hit that could be added at that point in time. So in the off season or now, that's just equal to projected cap space. But as we get through the season, the current cap space number is always higher because that, let's say we're halfway through the season, the current cap space number would be double the projected cap space number, because halfway through the season, if you trade for a player, you're only going to take half their cap hit. And so therefore, in terms of like the face value or the annual cap hit that you could add double what you have for projected space. And then deadline space is basically the same as current cap space, but it's what would the current cap space be on deadline day. So it's that same mechanism. On the deadline, there's about like 22% of the season remaining. So, it's like the inverse of 22% of the projected cap space. So a team that has about 1 million of projected cap space, their deadline cap space would be just over 4 million on deadline day. So that's how those numbers work. Those haven't changed, since the start of the salary cap. The playoff cap space, that is completely separate, as we talked about. It's a whole other system. And we have talked about how the way that it works, it makes the value of space accrual during the season a little less impactful, but there's actually no change been made to how space accrues during the season. It's just the way that the playoff cap works, where it doesn't factor in when you added a player during the season. It just makes the impact of accruing space and adding a player a little less impactful, because you may not be able to address all of the players in the playoffs, even though you were able to accrue space and add them in the regular season.
Yeah, I think that explanation is super helpful, because fans see all these numbers and they see projected cap space and deadline cap space, and they're trying to get an understanding of like what exactly that is and what goes into that calculation. And a lot of the accruing behind the scenes is not something that's outwardly known, but it's good to know that the math in the back end, equals that out. And I think it's good to have for fans to have an accurate understanding of what their teams are able to do at the trade deadline. And then we have our last question here from Brad H. So Brad asks, during the offseason, when you sign a free agent to league minimum that is waiver eligible and assign him to a minor league team, does that player have to clear waivers?
Yeah, so that we get a lot of questions about waivers. How much a player makes has no impact on waivers eligibility or requirements. The only thing that impacts waiver eligibility is experience. And so you can go on PuckPedia, we have all the rules, and you can click on a specific player and we'll show you the criteria in terms of years or games experience. But once a player is waiver eligible, that means they need waivers to be sent down. And so for a team to have that player in the minors, they must go on waivers first before they can be assigned. There's what's called the regular season waiver period, which started on September 25th. It's a certain number of days before the start of the season. So if a player was waived, let's just say in the summer for some reason, maybe to kind of make a point that nobody wants them or something, and they cleared that, they're still not eligible to be sent to the minors. They have to go on waivers anytime starting on the 25th of September, which is in that basically during training camp and on. So at this point now, if a player requires waivers in order for them to be in the AHL, they have to go on waivers first and then clear. We get some questions like what is the time period? So the waivers get announced every day at 2 p.m. Eastern. That's when the list of players on waivers gets distributed. And then teams have 24 hours to submit their claims if they want to, similar to like when people play fantasy sports, you submit your waiver claims, and then all those claims get resolved at 2 p.m. the following day. So it doesn't matter if a team submits the claim, at midnight or 6 in the morning, all the claims have to be submitted by 2 p.m. the next day. And then at 2 p.m. they get resolved. And it goes in waiver priority if multiple teams put a claim in. It's based on, at this point of the season, it's based on the regular season standings from last year in reverse. So the team that finished worse in the regular season standings last year they would have the highest priority if two teams put a claim in, and so on. And so this is the time of year where we see lots of action on the waiver wire. As we get closer to the opening season submission, for a player to be able to be sent down, they'd actually have to be on waivers the day before the opening roster. So then they could be sent down before the opening rosters are submitted. The only caveat would be, and we see this sometimes right before the season, if a player signs a contract and then is going to be put on waivers right away, they can already be assigned to the minors pending that waiver outcome. So they don't have to, let's say a team does that on the day that opening rosters get submitted, they don't actually have to have that player on their opening roster if they've signed them to a contract and agreed that they're going to go on waivers right away. So yeah, that's some of the rules around waivers, especially at the start of the season.
Yeah, it's a great distinction too. And like you mentioned, this time is probably the hottest time for waivers where you're seeing 20, 30, 40, 50 plus players a day kind of being put on the waiver wire. Just guys from training camp who don't have those contracts, like you mentioned, that are waiver eligible or exempt, and they have to go on waivers to then be sent down to the minors. You even see it with some trades, for example, like if a player gets traded, like then they have to like clear waivers to be able to get sent down to the minors. They don't automatically just be able to send that player down to the minors. So it is good to get that understanding. And we'll see if there's any kind of good waiver claims in the next few days as teams really, focus on their LTIR and their like salary cap compliance and optimization. But also there's a lot of good players that get passed through waivers at this time of year. And so sometimes teams are really trying to sneak players through at this time when there's so many guys going on. So we'll see kind of how that plays out in the next couple of days.
Yeah, definitely. There's players that clear waivers at the beginning of the season that later in the season people think, how could they have ever cleared waivers? But yeah, there's teams like their own players a lot in training camp, and they're trying to set their rosters. And so yeah, there are guys that can get sent down. And we should say, once a player clears waivers, they only need waivers again if they play 10 NHL games or they're on the NHL roster for 30 cumulative days. So they could be up and down, up and down. And as soon as they hit 30 days total where they've been on the NHL roster or played 10 NHL games, then they would need waivers again to be sent down. But until then, they're free to be sent up and down without needing waivers again.
Yeah, that's a good distinction too. And just another nuance of the salary cap that the general fan probably wouldn't have an understanding of, but PuckPedia and Hart Levine know it best. Well, that's all the time we have here for you. I think it was a great episode. We had a lot of good information on the playoff cap, the LTIR, the new CBA, a lot of stuff happening. NHL season starts in about a week and a half. Next Wednesday's episode, we're going to have a special NHL season preview with a couple of really special guests that we're excited about. So thank you for all the time, and let's enjoy some hockey, and let's see what happens in the next week or so as these kind of roster moves play out.
PuckPedia.com.